When Pope Urban II stepped up to the pulpit at the Council of Clermont on November 27, 1095, he could not have imagined what an unstoppable whirlwind his words would unleash across Europe. The Pope's passionate speech, which called upon the Christian world to recapture the Holy Land, found such resonance as perhaps never before in history. From every stratum of Christian Europe, knights, nobles, peasants, merchants, pilgrims, thousands upon thousands took up the cross. Thus began the First Crusade, which lasted from 1096 to 1099 and created legends that still captivate lovers of history today. The story of the First Crusade, however, was not only about glory. This was an epic undertaking that unleashed the deepest human passions: faith and doubt, heroism and cruelty, victory and tragedy. Over 3 years, such sieges took place, and such heroes rose and fell that became forever etched in the memory of the medieval world. The People's Crusade, Peter the Hermit's tragic enterprise. Even before the knights took up arms, the first wave was already underway. This was the People's Crusade, or otherwise known as the Peasants' Crusade, which began in 1096 before the official crusade. The movement's leader was a peculiar figure, Peter the Hermit, a tall, hairy, barefoot monk from Amiens. Peter was no ordinary man. According to contemporary sources, he was such an eloquent preacher that wherever he appeared, crowds gathered around him. Anna Komnenos, the Byzantine princess who saw him personally, described him thus: "Peter was a small man, but such fire burned in his eyes as I had never seen. When he spoke, it seemed as if the Lord himself spoke through him." Peter claimed that Jesus Christ himself had appeared to him in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem and commissioned him to preach the crusade. During his sermons, he also displayed a letter that he claimed was written by the Lord himself. According to sources, this letter had such an effect on the people that women tore out their hair and men writhed on the ground with excitement. By the spring of 1996, a huge crowd had gathered around Peter. Estimates suggest 40,000 people followed him: peasants, craftsmen, escaped serfs, prostitutes, robbers, but there were also knights among them, like Walter the Penniless, who became one of Peter's most important supporters. Walter the Penniless, as his name suggests, was an impoverished knight, but an experienced warrior. He led the vanguard of Peter's army, and when the impatient crowd could no longer wait for Peter to finish recruiting, he set off eastward. On May 8th, he crossed the Hungarian border, and initially everything went well. But disaster was already inevitable. Peter's huge army lacked proper supplies, weapons, or military organization. When Peter finally set out from Cologne on April 20th, he dragged behind him a mass that resembled the population of a wandering city rather than an army. Problems began already in Hungary. In Zemun, near the Byzantine border, an accidental conflict broke out over the price of a pair of shoes in the market. The situation quickly escalated, and Peter's followers attacked the city. Contemporary sources claim that 4,000 Hungarians lost their lives in the attack, while Peter's men plundered the city. Contemporary sources are exaggerated. In reality, several hundred, at most a few thousand people could have fallen victim to the riots. By the end of July, Peter's army finally reached Constantinople. Emperor Alexios I received him courteously but secretly worried. Anna Komnenos described the situation thus: "My father saw that this crowd was incapable of fighting, but too large to support. Therefore, as quickly as possible, he ferried them across to Asia." On August 1st, Peter crossed the Bosphorus with 30,000 men, but the real tragedy was only now beginning. Peter returned to Constantinople to ask for additional help, and in his absence, his army became completely undisciplined. Sources report that some of the Crusaders occupied a fort called Zerigordon, but soon the troops of Sultan Kilij Arslan I surrounded them. The siege lasted 8 days, during which the defenders suffered such thirst that they drank their horses' blood, swallowed each other's urine, and buried themselves in wet earth to find relief. On September 21st, the Turks finally captured the fort. Among the survivors, some renounced their faith to live as slaves, while others chose death. The final catastrophe occurred on October 21st. Near Sivatot, Sultan Kilij Arslan I personally led the attack against Peter's remaining army. Walter the Penniless died with 7 arrows in his body while desperately trying to rally his men. The Crusader army was almost completely annihilated. Of the 20,000-strong camp, barely 3,000 men escaped, rescued by Byzantine ships. Peter survived the disaster, as he was in Constantinople when the battle took place. According to contemporary sources, when he learned of his army's destruction, he wept for days. But this was not yet the end of the story for him. He later joined the real crusade and persisted until the capture of Jerusalem. If you enjoy this adventurous journey into the world of the Crusades, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Many more fascinating stories await us about the legendary heroes and battles of the Middle Ages, the ducal armies, the beginning of the real crusade. While Peter the Hermit's army was being destroyed in Anatolia, the leaders of the real crusade were preparing in Europe. These were not disorganized masses, but well-equipped armies led by experienced warriors. The main leaders included Duke Godfrey of Bouillon of Lorraine, Count Raymond of Toulouse, Prince Bohemond of Taranto, and Hugh of Vermandois, brother of King Philip I of France. In August 1096, exactly as Pope Urban II had planned, the real crusade began. The army set out on different routes to avoid supply problems, and by spring 1097, they had all gathered in Constantinople. Emperor Alexios I received them with mixed feelings. On one hand, he was pleased with the help against the Seljuks. On the other hand, he also feared these huge Western armies. He demanded an oath from every leader that they would return Byzantine territories to the emperor after recapturing them. This oath later caused serious conflicts, especially in Bohemond's case. The Siege of Nicaea, the first real trial. The first serious trial of the Crusader armies came at Nicaea, modern-day Iznik, in May 1097. The city was one of Sultan Kilij Arslan I's most important strongholds, and its strategic importance was enormous. It was the gateway through Anatolia to the Holy Land. The siege began on May 6th. The Crusader armies gathered in total strength of about 60,000 under the city walls. This was the largest Christian army the East had ever seen. Contemporary sources paint a stunning picture of the city. Nicaea's walls were massive. Byzantine sources describe them as 10 to 15 meters high, protected by 260 towers. The city was connected on 3 sides to Lake Ascanius, which ensured water supply. Sultan Kilij Arslan I initially underestimated the Crusaders. After easily defeating Peter the Hermit's army, he thought these new Frankish barbarians posed no serious threat. Therefore, he personally left to campaign in other areas, leaving Nicaea with a small garrison. This was a serious mistake. The Crusaders methodically surrounded the city and built huge siege engines. Raymond de Aguilera, the contemporary chronicler, describes the site thus: "The Franks erected such massive wooden structures as the world had never seen. The siege towers were as tall as the city walls, and machines hurled stones that made noise like thunder." When Kilij Arslan learned of the danger, he returned in a forced march and tried to relieve the city. On May 21st, a great battle took place under the city, where the Sultan's forces suffered a heavy defeat. Contemporary Crusader chroniclers wrote about this battle as a divine miracle, but the Crusaders' biggest problem was that they could not completely surround Nicaea from the lake side. However, Emperor Alexios I came to their aid. He transported ships overland to the lake, and thus the blockade became complete. On June 18th, after 7 weeks of siege, Nicaea surrendered. But here occurred a turn that created serious tension between the Crusaders and Byzantines. The city fell directly into Alexios I's hands, not the Crusaders. The Byzantine negotiator secretly made an agreement with the defenders, and when the Crusaders wanted to enter the city the next day, they saw Byzantine flags on the walls. The Crusaders were furious because they could not share in the plunder, but Alexios tried to compensate them with gold and valuable gifts. Duke Godfrey and Count Raymond accepted the situation, But Bohemond deeply noted this betrayal, and later this influenced his decisions. The Battle of Dorylaeum, against nomadic tactics. After capturing Nicaea, the Crusader army continued south towards Syria. However, on July 1st, Sultan Kilij Arslan I returned with a huge army consisting not only of Seljuks, but also warriors from other Turkish tribes. The Sultan now knew he faced serious opponents and staked everything on one card. The decisive battle took place near Dorylaeum. This battle was extremely important because it tested Western heavy cavalry tactics against Eastern light cavalry warfare. The Crusader army was divided into two parts during the march. The first part was led by Bohemond and Tancred, while the main force followed under the leadership of Godfrey, Raymond, and the others. This proved fortunate because when Kilij Arslan attacked unexpectedly, Bohemond's men could hold the front until help arrived. According to contemporary sources, the Turkish attack began at dawn. The anonymous author of the Gesta Francorum describes it thus: "Such shouting and clamor arose as we had never heard. The pagans surrounded us like wolves around sheep and shot arrows from all sides." The Turkish tactic was for their light cavalry to make quick attacks, then withdraw, while continuously shooting arrows at the Crusaders. This tactic initially confused the heavily armored Franks because they could not respond with close combat. However, Bohemond recognized the severity of the situation and made a brilliant decision. He remained in tight formation with his men and sent a message to the main force. Meanwhile, the women of the Crusader army, yes, there were women in the camp, carried water to the warriors and cared for the wounded. The turning point came when Godfrey and Raymond's forces arrived at noon. According to the Gesta Francorum, "When our men saw Duke Godfrey's banner and Count Raymond's flag on the hilltop, they let out such a cry of joy that the mountains echoed with it." The coordinated attack broke Turkish resistance. Kilij Arslan, seeing his army beginning to disintegrate, was forced to retreat. The Crusaders achieved complete victory, and thus the road through Anatolia to Syria became free. The capture of Edessa, birth of the First Crusade state. While the main army marched south, a special episode took place that led to the founding of the First Crusader state. Baldwin of Boulogne, Godfrey's brother, separated from the main army with a smaller force and turned east toward Edessa, modern Şanlıurfa. This decision was based on personal ambition. Baldwin saw that his brother Godfrey would be the leader of the crusade, and he himself wanted to found a principality. In Edessa at that time ruled an Armenian prince, Thoros II, who was seeking an ally against the Turks. Baldwin arrived in Edessa in February 1998, and Thoros adopted him as his son. But in the second week of March, Thoros died in a popular uprising. Sources suggest Baldwin was not innocent in this. The people of Edessa chose Baldwin as their prince, and thus was born the First Crusader state, the county of Edessa. This event created an important precedent. Baldwin proved that the Crusaders wanted not only to liberate the Holy Land, but also to found their own states. This was later repeated in the cases of Antioch and Jerusalem. The Siege of Antioch, the epic 8 months. The most emblematic and dramatic event of the First Crusade was undoubtedly the Siege of Antioch. This huge city, the third largest metropolis of the contemporary world after Constantinople and Alexandria, withstood the siege of Crusader armies from October 20th, 1097 to June 3rd, 1098, for a total of 8 months. The city of Antioch presented a stunning sight to the Crusaders. According to contemporary sources, the walls were about 15 kilometers long and protected by 400 towers. The city was built into a hillside, and the citadel was located in an almost impregnable height. Yagi Sian, the Seljuk governor of the city, had been preparing for the siege for months. He accumulated food and asked for help from neighboring Muslim rulers. The Crusader armies arrived under the city on October 20th. According to the agreement between the leaders, they surrounded the city. Bohemond at the St. Paul Gate, Raymond and Bishop Ademar at the Dog Gate, while the other leaders blocked the other gates. But it soon became clear that a complete blockade was impossible. The city was too large for the Crusader army to completely surround, and the Muslim defenders could continuously maintain contact with the outside world. Moreover, the Crusaders' supply became increasingly difficult as time passed. The winter was terrible. Contemporary sources report horrible famine. The historian Albert of Aachen writes, "So great was the hunger that people made food from grass, leaves, and tree roots. Many died, and there were so many dead that they could not bury them." Morale grew increasingly worse. In January 1098, Peter the Hermit and William the Carpenter, two known members of the Crusader army, fled. Bohemond's men went after them and brought them back. Peter received forgiveness, but William was humiliated and had to swear that he would stay. The situation became even more embittered when in February, the Byzantine general Tatikios left the Crusader camp and returned to Constantinople. Bohemond claimed that Tatikios had betrayed them, and this would later serve as an excuse to break his oath to Alexios I. The finding of the Holy Lance, divine intervention or cunning. In June 1098, when the situation seemed almost hopeless, an extraordinary event occurred that changed the course of the siege. A poor Provençal peasant, Peter Bartholomew, came forward with a fantastic story. Bartholomew claimed that for several months, St. Andrew the Apostle had appeared to him in visions and shown him where the Holy Lance could be found in Antioch, the lance with which the Roman soldier pierced Jesus' side on the cross. Bartholomew's story was received skeptically. Bishop Adhemar, the papal legate of the Crusade, strongly doubted it. But Count Raymond of Toulouse, who was Bohemond's rival for power, seized the opportunity. If he were the one to find the Holy Lance, it would mean enormous prestige for him. On June 15th, Raymond ordered digging in St. Peter's Cathedral. They dug all day but found nothing. The Count was already about to leave in disappointment when Peter Bartholomew, dressed only in a simple shirt, jumped into the pit and triumphantly pulled out a rusty piece of iron, claiming it was the Holy Lance. The effect of the discovery was lightning-like. According to contemporary sources, frenzied joy seized the Crusader camp. Men wept, women fell to their knees, priests sang Te Deum. Raymond de Aguilera, Count Raymond's chaplain and reliable historian who was present at the events, described it thus: "I saw the iron in the ground before Peter pulled it out. This was a true miracle." But not everyone believed in the miracle. Bohemond and his men doubted and secretly suspected that the whole thing was an organized deception for Raymond's benefit. The Byzantine princess Anna Komnenos later wrote that, in her opinion, this was a typical Frankish fraud. However it was, the finding of the Holy Lance changed the morale of the Crusader army. People again believed in divine help and were ready for the final great trial, the decisive battle, liberation of Antioch. Another turning point was also approaching. Kerboga, the Atabeg of Mosul, had finally assembled his huge army and was rushing to relieve Antioch. Everyone in the Muslim world knew, if Kerboga defeated the Crusaders, it would mean the end of the entire crusade. Fortunately for the Crusaders, Kerboga wasted 3 weeks besieging Edessa, where he could achieve no results against Baldwin. This gave the Crusaders time for the final blow. Meanwhile, Bohemond secretly negotiated with Firuz, an Armenian guard who watched the Tower of the Two Sisters. Firuz's motivations remain unclear to this day. He may have been motivated by money or revenge, but he agreed to let Bohemond's men into the city. On June 2nd, Bohemond shared the plan with the other leaders and made a proposal. Whoever captures the city should be its ruler. Raymond protested, saying it should be returned to Emperor Alexios, but the others accepted Bohemond's proposal, mainly because they knew they would otherwise perish against Kerboga. At dawn on June 3rd, 60 of Bohemond's knights climbed the walls with Firuz's help. They occupied the northwestern towers, opened the gates, and the Crusader army entered Antioch. Governor Yaghi Sian died while fleeing, but the citadel still held out. The massacre was terrible. According to contemporary sources, the Crusaders killed everything in their path: Muslims, Jews, but even Armenian and Greek Christians. This bloodbath deeply shook the contemporary Muslim world. The second siege, the besiegers under siege. But the joy did not last long. On June 7th, Kerboga's huge army arrived, and now the Crusaders became the besieged. The situation was desperate. Outside a huge Muslim army, up in the citadel Seljuk defenders, inside the city, starving, sick Crusaders. Kerboga's army was estimated at 75,000 men, while the Crusaders had barely 30,000 fighters. According to contemporary sources, the situation was like iron caught between hammer and anvil. Crusader morale collapsed again. Many began to flee again, including Stephen, Count of Blois, who on his way home met Emperor Alexios I and told him the Crusaders were lost. Upon this, the emperor turned back instead of rushing to their aid. This permanently ruined the relationship between Bohemond and Byzantium. June 28th, the day of miracle. In this hopeless situation, Peter Bartholomew reported new visions. St. Andrew told him that if the Crusaders purified themselves with fasting and prayer, then marched out of the city with the Holy Lance at the head, divine help would arrive. On June 28th, after 5 days of fasting, the Crusader army indeed marched out of Antioch. According to contemporary sources, Bishop Adhemar rode in the front rank on a white horse, holding the Holy Lance high. Behind him marched the army, knights, infantry, and even the wounded who could stand. What happened next remains mysterious to this day. The Muslim army, which was superior in numbers, unexpectedly collapsed. Kerboga's allies abandoned the battlefield, and the Muslim armies fled. Contemporary Crusader chroniclers wrote of divine intervention. Sources report they saw heavenly knights galloping on white horses behind the Crusaders. The victory was complete. Kerboga himself barely escaped, and the Muslim world was deeply shaken to learn that the Frankish barbarians had defeated the most powerful Muslim army. Post-Antioch crisis and Peter's tragic end. Despite victory, the Crusader army could not immediately move forward. In August, an epidemic broke out, probably typhus, which caused severe losses. Bishop Adhemar, the spiritual leader of the crusade, died in August, which had an enormous impact on morale. After Adhemar's death, Peter Bartholomew tried to take over spiritual leadership, but his further visions became increasingly bizarre. He claimed that Bishop Adhemar was suffering in hell because he doubted the Holy Lance, and he also said that Christ had commissioned him to weed out the sinners from the Crusader army. These statements caused deep division. Arnulf, chaplain of Rohes, the priest of Duke Robert of Normandy, openly challenged Peter Bartholomew and demanded divine judgment, the trial by fire. On April 8th, 1099, Good Friday, during the siege of Arca, Peter Bartholomew accepted the trial. 2 huge bonfires were built, leaving a narrow corridor between them. Peter, wearing only a tunic and carrying the Holy Lance in his hand, walked through the flames. Contemporary eyewitnesses reported differently about the event. Some said he came out unharmed, but the crowd immediately surrounded and trampled him. Others said he already suffered severe burns in the fire. Peter Bartholomew died on April 20th, 12 days later, in agony. With his death, the authenticity of the Holy Lance was also questioned. Count Raymond's prestige was severely damaged, and spiritual leadership of the crusade passed to others. But the lance itself remained and haunted the Crusaders for years to come. Toward Jerusalem, the final stage. In January 1099, the Crusader army could finally continue toward Jerusalem. But they were no longer the enthusiastic masses that had set out 3 years earlier. Of the 80,000 who had gathered in Constantinople, only about 20,000 remained. The others had died of disease, in battle, or returned home. Serious conflicts also existed among the crusade leaders. Bohemond remained in Antioch as ruler of the newly founded principality. Baldwin ruled in Edessa. The main army was now led by Count Raymond and Duke Godfrey, but tension also grew between them. The road to Jerusalem was relatively easy. After Kerboga's defeat, the Muslim world became completely disorganized, and local emirs successively surrendered or allied with the Crusaders. In May, the army reached the Lebanon mountains, and from there they could already see the plains of the Holy Land. The siege of Jerusalem, reaching the sacred goal. On June 7, 1099, the Crusader army caught sight of Jerusalem's walls. According to contemporary sources, the warriors burst into tears at the sight. The chronicler Ralph de Caen described the moment thus: "When the pilgrims saw the holy city, they fell to their knees, and such sobbing arose as I had never heard. Men and women alike cried like children." Jerusalem was not in Muslim, but Fatimid hands at that time. The Fatimids, caliphs based in Cairo, had meanwhile expelled the Seljuks and held the city under governor Iftikhar al-Dawla. The Fatimids also offered peace to the Crusaders, free pilgrimage and worship in the city, but the Crusaders rejected this. They needed complete control. The siege was extremely difficult. Jerusalem's walls were almost impregnable. Moreover, the Crusaders did not have adequate siege engines. There was sufficient food and water in the city, while the Crusader camp suffered in the July heat. The turning point came with the arrival of the Genoese. Admiral Guglielmo Embriaco's ships docked at Jaffa, and the sailors helped build siege towers and catapults with their expertise. The Crusaders carried wood from the Judean hills and worked for days to complete the siege engines. July 15th, capture of the Holy City. The final assault began on July 13th. Raymond's forces attacked at the southern gate, while Godfrey and Tancred attacked the northern wall. The battle was desperate on both sides. The Muslim defenders poured hot oil and Greek fire on the attackers, while the Crusaders continuously stormed the walls. On the morning of July 15th, Godfrey's men achieved a breakthrough on the northern wall. Godfrey's men and Tancred were the first to climb over the walls and burst into the city. The defenders panicked and began to flee. What followed was one of the most horrible massacres of medieval warfare. The Crusaders slaughtered in the city for 3 days. They massacred every Muslim and Jew they could catch, men, women, children alike. According to contemporary sources, blood reached knee-deep in the temple. Raymond de Aguilé, the eyewitness chronicler, described it thus: "It was wonderful to see when we came to Solomon's temple tower. Our men's feet and ankles were bathed in blood that flowed from the severed heads of bodies." The massacre was so terrible that even contemporary Christian chroniclers were horrified by it. But for the Crusaders, this was divine justice. For centuries they had suffered under pagan rule, and now they had finally reclaimed what they believed was always theirs. Duke Godfrey was chosen as King of Jerusalem, though he preferred the title Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. The new Crusader states, end and beginning of an era. On August 12, 1099, the Crusaders achieved another great victory when they defeated the Egyptian Fatimid armies near Ascalon. This secured Jerusalem's safety, and the First Crusade was completed. The Crusaders created 4 states: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa, and later the County of Tripoli. These states lasted for almost 200 years and fundamentally determined the history of the Middle East, the legacy and the fate of heroes. The fate of the First Crusade's heroes varied. Duke Godfrey died in Jerusalem on July 18, 1100, probably of typhus. His successor was his brother Baldwin, who took the royal title. Bohemond ruled Antioch for years, but in August 1100 he was captured by the Turks. He was imprisoned for 3 years before being freed. Later, he returned to Europe to recruit reinforcements and started another war against Byzantium. Count Raymond never received his own state, but founded the County of Tripoli, which flourished under his son's rule. Peter the Hermit survived the crusade, returned to France, and founded a monastery where he died in 1015. Tancred, Bohemond's nephew, became Prince of Galilee, then later regent of Antioch. The bravest battles of the First Crusade are associated with his name, and he was the embodiment of chivalric ideals. Historical impact, when East and West met. The First Crusade was not merely a military enterprise, it was such an encounter between 2 civilizations that permanently changed both. The Crusaders brought Eastern science, technology, and culture to the West. They became acquainted with Arab medicine, Byzantine architecture, and built trade connections that lasted for centuries. At the same time, the Muslim world also realized the strength of Western Christianity. The Crusade had a shocking effect on them. Previously, they considered the Franks barbaric plunderers, but now they had to acknowledge they faced an organized, determined, and powerful enemy. Medieval chroniclers, both Christian and Muslim, viewed the First Crusade as a turning point in history. Anna Komnenos described the final result thus: "The whole world changed. The Franks, who were barbarians, now became lords in the East. The Muslims, who were masters of the world, now flee on their own land." If you enjoyed this epic journey into the world of the Crusades, don't hesitate to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with friends. Many more fascinating stories await us from the legendary battles and heroes of the Middle Ages. In the next part, we'll deal with the drama of the Second Crusade and the rise of Nur al-Din II, showing how the Muslims began to reclaim the lost territories. Don't miss out and join us among history's greatest adventures. The power of memory. The story of the First Crusade still captivates us today because everything can be found in it that touches the deepest layers of human nature: faith and doubt, heroism and cruelty, victory and tragedy, dreams and ambitions. These people, Peter the Hermit, Bohemond, Godfrey, Raymond, and the others, left behind a world that was forever changed. The Crusader states they created lasted for 200 years, but their impact extended much further. They opened trade routes between East and West, established the cultural exchange that later became the foundation of the Renaissance, and created stories that continue to inspire writers, directors, and historians today. But perhaps their most important legacy is that they showed human determination and faith are capable of achieving seemingly impossible things. When the first poor Crusaders set out for Jerusalem in 1096, no one would have believed that 3 years later they would indeed hold the holy city in their hands. This determination, however, did not come without bloodshed. Tens of thousands died on the way, and the Crusades opened those religious and cultural wounds whose effects are still felt today. But those people who wrote this story with sweat, blood, and tears, from 1096 to 1099, forever changed the world. The First Crusade is not merely a historical event. It is an epic that shows every aspect of human nature. And that is precisely why it remains eternally fascinating for us, who, more than 900 years later, try to understand these extraordinary people and extraordinary times.